Okay, this lecture is going to be on plant structure, growth, and development. It is chapter 35 in your text, about 17 pages, but we'll cut some stuff out, and I will include only the important parts, in my opinion, in this lecture here. And of course, you are only going to be tested on what's in this lecture. All right, so when it comes to plant structure, basically, if we get down to the basics of it, we have stems and we have root systems. And so when we look at the stem systems, a stem is basically going to be have two parts. Number one, where the node attaches, what the node is. And the node is basically where the leaves attach to the stem. That's a node. If you think back to our phylogenetic trees, it has a lot of the same terminology because phylogenetic tree, they base it off of it. And so we also have an internode, and an internode is basically the section between the nodes there, which is where the leaves are attaching. Okay. At the nodes and at the end of many of the stems are structures called buds. And buds can basically be one of two kinds. You can have an apical bud, which is also known as a terminal bud, and this is usually going to be at the tip of a stem, either at the top of the plant or at the tip of a side stem. And this is basically going to be at the very end, and that is going to serve the main purpose of elongating that stem, making that stem longer. These are also going to be at the tips of roots, and they're basically going to be elongating that root, making it longer. And then we also have axillary buds. And axillary buds are on the sides of stems, and they basically produce usually flowers, or they can produce lateral branches. And so those are our two types of buds. And you can see some images here of those. So for example, we have spring coming up here soon, if not occurring right now when you're watching this. And so, if you walk outside, you'll probably see a lot of buds like this. And a lot of these buds are going to turn into leaves. And then later on, usually in the spring for most plants, these buds are going to be popping up again, and then they're going to be producing flowers. And so these buds can produce flowers, they can produce leaves, and then the apical buds. So these are all axillary buds that you're seeing here, but the apical buds will just be pushing that stem or root and making it longer. Okay, another example of a flower there a little bit later in the season. So let's talk about leaves then a little bit. Leaves generally consist of a blade portion, which commonly has vascular tissue running throughout. And so we commonly call those veins. And those veins are vascular tissue, which is xylem and phloem, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. And so the flattened blade portion, as you can see here, and you also have a stalk that attaches to the stem. That stalk is called a petiole. And you can see by that image there, the blade, petiole, stem. When a seedling emerges from the soil, recall in the last lecture when we talked about seeds, and we talked about endosperm, and the endosperm will turn into cotyledons after germination. That's what you're seeing there. So those two leaves that you see in green aren't really leaves. They're actually cotyledons. You can actually see the first leaf starting to form right in the middle between those two large cotyledons. That is going to be the baby shoot coming up, and it's going to have the first leaves, actual leaves on it, but they haven't yet formed. So those are the cotyledons. And so as you can see, what happens is when that little baby plant germinates, the cotyledons are quite large. the baby plant is using those cotyledons for nutrients. So it's basically sucking all the nutrients out of those cotyledons over time. And so over time, those cotyledons get smaller and smaller and smaller until they wither and then drop off and disappear. And so basically, again, this is the nutrient pack. This is the nutrient lunch of this baby little plant. And it's using these nutrients to grow when it's very young. So we have many leaf types. Leaves can be simple, where you just have, like at the top there, a simple leaf. A simple blade is attached to a petiole. That petiole is attached to a stem. Voila. But you can also have a little bit more complicated things going on. For example, you can have a compound leaf where you have multiple blades attached to a single petiole, and then that petiole attaches to a stem. And you can even double this again, where you have a doubly compound leaf, where you have multiple leaflets on multiple blades on one petiole. And so notice in that diagram on the bottom, you have leaflets, and those leaflets are attached to basically multiple blades on a petiole. Okay. Excuse me. You could also have modified leaves. So, for example, leaves may be modified for many different things. Leaves can be made for defense. Spines on, for example, our cactus are leaves. They're just modified leaves. Leaves can be made for support. So, for example, the vines and tendrils on many plants are modified leaves. Leaves can be used for reproduction. We talked about that in ferns, where we had sporophylls. Sporophylls are spore-holding leaves. Also, petals on flowers are modified leaves. And then you can have leaves for storage as well. For example, leaves that hold liquid inside them. Think of aloe vera, right? That is a leaf that is very, very thick, very fat, and it holds in it a lot of liquid and other nutrients for the plant. And also you have carnivorous plants that can use leaves for consuming other organisms, like the Venus flytrap or carnivorous pitcher plants, where the leaf is actually a pitcher that holds water and then drowns insects or other organisms that fall in. It's like that. There you go. There's Sarracenia purpurea, a pitcher plant where that leaf has been turned into a cup that holds water that insects will drown in, and then those insects will be digested by the enzymes inside and absorbed by the plant itself. Now, when you think about roots, right, so those are stem systems. So when you talk about root systems, roots, their main purpose is going to be absorbing water, absorbing minerals, taking them up through the root structure, and giving nutrients and supplying nutrients to the plant in that way. The main structure that is going to be doing most of this absorbing and most of this taking up of nutrients are the root hairs. You can think of the roots as just the structures for which the root hairs can attach, because the root hairs are doing most of the work here. The rhizosphere is an area that's referred to as this surrounding soil and water and nutrients and microorganisms that are directly around all the roots and root hairs. These include many things. Secretions by the plant, oftentimes chemical secretions, sometimes defensive chemical secretions. So, for example, some plants will secrete defensive chemicals that prevent other plants from living near them. So basically, it's like a poisonous boundary around those plants to prevent anybody getting too close or growing too closely. You also have mycorrhizal fungi. We talked about this a little bit in previous plant chapters, but mycorrhizal fungi are basically a group of fungi that live mutualistically with most plants on Earth, and most plants on Earth could not survive without those fungi that are growing sometimes inside, sometimes outside, or attached to the roots of many plants. We'll talk about them a little bit more in chapter 31 when we get to fungi. Rhizosphere can also include bacteria, of course, other microorganisms such as protists, and of course animals like nematodes, earthworms, and other small organisms. So we shouldn't just gloss over roots, because roots are extremely important not just for the plant biologically, but also ecologically for their surrounding environment. Roots play a vital role in holding soils together and preventing erosion. Mangrove roots are especially important for maintaining soil and maintaining coastlines on areas that are close to the ocean and close to water sources. You can see in this picture here of that exact thing happening, where that soil would most likely disappear if it were not for the root structure that is holding it in place. This is extremely important when it gets to preventing storm damage from hurricanes, from larger storms, from tsunamis and things, where these roots will maintain the shorelines, prevent erosion when that storm comes ashore. And this was especially prevalent during Hurricane Katrina, where historically settlers in Louisiana depopulated the shoreline and deforested the shoreline of mangrove swamps and other marshes and swampy areas. And so when Hurricane Katrina came in, there was really nothing to stop the water except for a few badly made dams, and therefore you have all that destruction happening. So when we talked about eudicots and monocots in the last chapter in angiosperms, we discussed root structure a little bit, saying that eudicots have a certain type of root and monocots have another type of root. Here is basically going over that same thing. Taproots are going to be present in eudicots, and fibrous root systems are going to be prevalent in monocots. This is also going to be an obvious feature when you guys are looking at these things in lab, and so it might help you to associate these with some things that you saw during your lab sections. So when it comes to plant structure, so stem systems and root systems are the basic overall structure of plants, but also we can go a little bit deeper and look into the tissues. And so the tissues of plants can really be separated into three main types. And those are going to be, so you can see them here in that diagram: vascular tissue, ground tissue, and dermal tissue. We'll go inside out, and so we'll talk about the vascular tissue first here. You already know a little bit about this because we talked about xylem and phloem before when defining moss, pteridophytes, and the other higher plants. But vascular tissue are basically going to be xylem that carries water and ions from the soil up into the plant. All xylem cells are going to be dead when they're mature. So what happens is the cell walls of these plants are going to be maintained, but the insides, the cytoplasm, and all the organelles are going to be basically disintegrated. The cell membrane is going to be washed away, and even the parts of the cell wall that are on the top and the bottom are going to be dissolved as well. So what you're left with is a ring of cell wall. And what happens is these rings of cell wall stack and stack and stack and stack, and you get this tube of dead cell walls that make up xylem. The other part is, of course, phloem. Phloem carries photosynthate from the leaves to the rest of the plant. Photosynthate is basically a fancy term for sucrose, just the products of photosynthesis. And they are, of course, alive. Phloem basically has two main types of cells. One is the sieve tube cells. The sieve tube cells are going to be actively carrying sugars through the plant. And there are going to be cells that are going to be loading those sugars into the sieve tube cells. And those are called the companion cells. Vascular tissue is going to make up veins and leaves. These veins and leaves, when looked at in a cross section, basically taking a leaf, cutting it, and then looking at the cut, a vein turns into a circle, right? That circle is called a vascular bundle. Okay, so xylem and phloem are in that vein. So when you're looking at a vascular bundle, you are going to be looking at cells that are making up xylem and cells that are making up phloem. And in lab, we'll look at this. So there you go. The vascular tissues threaded through ground tissue. The veins and leaves are the vascular bundles. And so if we look at xylem, notice that it's basically stacks of cell walls put on top of each other. These are all dead at maturity. And then in phloem, we have two main types of cells. As you see on the bottom left diagram there, we have large sieve tube cells, and then we have companion cells adjacent to those. And these are alive at maturity. So, again, when looking at the cross sections of leaves or the cross sections of stems, you can see these small circles. These small circles are vascular bundles. These vascular bundles are made up of xylem and phloem cells. And in lab, we'll examine these vascular bundles, the arrangement of these vascular bundles, and the examination of their arrangement can often tell you whether it's a monocot or a eudicot plant. Our second type of tissue is ground tissue. And ground tissue is where all the photosynthesis occurs within the plant. And so usually most of this ground tissue that is going to be important in photosynthesis is within the leaves. So within the leaf, you have up top, you have an upper epidermis. You then have what we call mesophyll, basically photosynthetic ground tissue. And then you have a bottom or lower epidermis. So basically the bottom of the leaf, mesophyll in between, and then upper epidermis. Sometimes you could also have those veins running through a leaf as well. Those veins are, of course, xylem and phloem, like we just talked about, vascular tissue. But mesophyll is the term that is generally used to describe the photosynthetic ground tissue that is between the upper and lower epidermis. And so you also have holes in the upper and lower epidermis, usually in the lower epidermis, that are called stomata. And stomata are basically going to be holes that let in CO2 and oxygen and then push out CO2 and oxygen. And this air is going to flow in between the mesophyll cells because the mesophyll cells is where photosynthesis is occurring. Photosynthesis requires, as you know, carbon dioxide to work, and so it's going to suck up the CO2, push out O2, and that O2 will go out through the stomata. So if we look at a diagram of a leaf, we see up the top there, upper epidermis. We see at the bottom, lower epidermis, the stomata. Notice we have cells, I can't point to it, but in purple there, called guard cells. Guard cells are the cells that are just on the edge of the stomatal opening. And these guard cells are the cells that control whether that stomata opens or closes. Sometimes the plant wants to close stomata, sometimes it wants to open stomata. It depends upon the guard cells to do that. All this in between here is mesophyll. So all that is ground tissue that is going through photosynthesis. And you also have in the blue, happens to be a vein with the xylem and phloem running through it. So our last type of tissue in plants is dermal tissue. Dermal tissue is usually epidermis, and excuse me. So if you think about it, does a tulip have bark? No. Excuse me. No, it does not. Um, that is because a tulip does not grow bark. So what is the outermost layer of a tulip? That is going to be the epidermis. That is both on the stem and on the leaves. So the epidermis is going to be the outermost cellular layer in what we call herbaceous plants. We'll define this a little bit later, what a herbaceous plant is specifically. And the epidermis is going to be this outermost cellular layer. It's going to be excreting a waxy substance called the cuticle. So what is the most external structure in these herbaceous plants is the cuticle, but the most external cellular biotic layer is the epidermis. The cuticle is not alive. It is just wax. And so you can see in this diagram, you have, like the cuticle all the way up the top, and then you have the epidermal cells, and then you start getting into the ground tissue, the photosynthetic cells. So let's get a little even deeper. Right, we talked about stems and roots. We got a little bit more specific, talked about 3 types of tissues. Let's get even more specific, talk about the 3 types of cells that make up those tissues. So you have these 3 types of cells. The first are the parenchyma. Parenchyma makes up what we call primary growth. These are going to be herbaceous parts of plants, basically green, squishy parts of plants that go through photosynthesis. Parenchyma cells are going to be integral in photosynthesis. They're going to be integral in storage. They're going to be integral in secretion, tissue repair. Most of the activities of a cell are done by parenchyma cells. Parenchyma cells are also going to have a very thin cell wall and are going to look very fat in the middle, sort of like adipose or fat cells in animals. Parenchyma is a little bit thicker in the cell wall, and their main function is to support growing plant parts but provide flexible, bendy support without being very rigid but without breaking. And so that's the main role of parenchyma. You can think of this in like a dandelion or a herbaceous plant that will bend in the wind, but it won't break. That's parenchyma. And then of course we have sclerenchyma, and sclerenchyma is going to be very, very thick cell walls, lots of lignin. Lignin is a very large chemical that basically gives these cells a lot of strong support, makes them very rigid, and that's the main role of these cells, rigid support for the plant. This is present in things like bark, periderm, which we'll talk about later. So if we look at our cell types, notice in the left diagram at the top, parenchyma cells look like fat cells, thin cell walls, big cytoplasm. And then on the bottom there, we see parenchyma cells, where we have a little bit of a medium-sized cell wall in the orange color. And then we have a smaller cytoplasm. And then on the right here, we have sclerenchyma. We have extremely thick cell walls, and the cytoplasm is reduced to a very, very small portion of the cell. So when we get to plants and growth, plants, unlike animals, only grow at specific parts of their body. These parts of their body where growth occurs are called meristems. And there's going to be 2 types of meristems depending on where in the plant we're talking about. Are we talking about the plant growing up and down, or are we talking about the plant growing wider? Those are the 2 big types of growth. Growing longer, or if you're a root, I guess deeper, or are you making the stems and the roots fatter and thicker? So apical meristems are those types of growth points, types of areas of division, which is a meristem, that is at the tips of shoots and the very tips of roots, making these parts longer, making branches longer, making the top of the plant longer, making roots longer. This is called primary growth. So basically, it is the elongation of plant parts. This occurs in all plants. Okay, this is also going to be bendy, green, squishy growth. Think of a tulip, where you have all primary growth. All plants have this. It's just that some plants replace this primary growth with something we call secondary growth. But those plants that do not, the plants that just have primary growth, are called herbaceous plants. So the other type of meristem are called lateral meristems, and lateral meristems are on the inside of roots and shoots and stems. And basically their job, as I mentioned before, is to make these stems and roots and things wider. This is called secondary growth. And what secondary growth does is it makes stems hard and lignified, and this only occurs in some plants. Only gymnosperms and eudicots are going to have secondary growth. Okay? There are no monocots that have secondary growth. All monocots are primary growth herbaceous plants only. They're green and squishy, right? So plants that do not have secondary growth, as I was just mentioning, are called herbaceous or non-woody plants. And so when we talk about lateral meristems, we're really not talking about monocots. We're not talking about tulips. We're not talking about those herbaceous plants. Now, I should stop for a second here because this is slightly confusing. So, all plants have lateral meristems, but some plants have those lateral meristems creating secondary growth. Some plants have those lateral meristems just going through primary growth and producing a little bit of xylem and phloem. So what I mentioned up here, that secondary growth comes from lateral meristems, it's true, but not all lateral meristems produce secondary growth. So for example, you have a tulip. A tulip has apical meristems to make it longer and deeper into the ground for roots. It also has lateral meristems, but those lateral meristems just produce a little bit of xylem, a little bit of phloem, and then they're done. It's all herbaceous growth. In, say, like an oak tree or a pine tree or a maple tree, you have apical meristems, so they're making them taller, making them deeper. And you also have lateral meristems that are making xylem and phloem. But in that oak tree, pine tree, apple tree, those lateral meristems are not just producing one little bit of xylem and phloem, they're producing cells upon cells upon cells. Every growing season, they're producing a new layer of xylem, a new layer of phloem, new layer of xylem, new layer of phloem. And these xylem and phloem layers harden and harden and harden, and this becomes secondary growth. So I want to make that distinction because that's a little bit confusing. Okay, both of these types of meristems are present in all plants, but they have a slightly more advanced purpose in our hardened, woody trees, plants that have secondary growth. So There's two kinds of lateral meristems. The first is a vascular cambium. The vascular cambium is basically what is producing xylem and phloem. Okay? Excuse me. Vascular cambium is present in 100% of plants. All plants have this. The first thing it produces when it's a little baby seedling, the vascular cambium produces primary xylem to the inside, primary phloem to the outside. Basically, primary just means the first layer. And so as you can see from this diagram, this is in a baby seedling. You have that little red line in the middle. That's the vascular cambium. Vascular cambium is producing, as you can see in the orange, phloem to the outside. That's primary phloem. And then in the blue, primary xylem on the inside. That's in the first year, that's what it's producing. After that, it's going to produce more and more and more layers on top of that. So what vascular cambium is doing is making that stem wider by producing xylem on the inside and phloem on the outside. With herbaceous plants, we stop here. You produce xylem, phloem, that's it. That's all the vascular cambium does. But like I was mentioning, your secondary growth comes from extra layers put down in our woody plants. So your oak tree, your pine tree, things like that, they're going to add even more layers of xylem on the inside and even more layers of phloem on the outside. So your stems are going to get wider and wider and wider. These extra layers of phloem and extra layers of xylem are called secondary xylem. There's no such thing as tertiary phloem and xylem. It's either primary your first year or secondary year 2 through 5,000 or however long the tree lives. It's all secondary xylem and phloem after that. Secondary xylem has a more common name, wood. Okay, that's the inside of the plant that we commonly use in industry for furniture, things like that. That is what we use for carpentry. That is wood, secondary xylem. Okay, laid down on the inside after the first year. Because the primary xylem and the primary phloem were laid down first, they're laid down, and then the vascular cambium's in the middle as it produces secondary xylem and secondary phloem. After that, the primary phloem and the primary xylem gets pushed out further and further and further and further away from the vascular cambium in the middle, the older the plant gets. So if we look at a really old plant, it's going to have primary phloem all the way out here, primary xylem all the way up here, and then the vascular cambium in the middle, and everything here is going to be secondary phloem, and everything here is going to be secondary xylem, and then this is going to be the center of the plant right here. And then the bark is all the way out here. Okay? So, as I said, all plants possess vascular cambium, but depending on what type of plant it is, it's just going to produce one layer of primary xylem and phloem and then be done, like a tulip or an orchid or some herbaceous plant. Or if it's a tree with woody structures, it's going to lay down that secondary phloem and secondary xylem. So we said there are two types of lateral meristems. The first was a vascular cambium. The second is the cork cambium. The cork cambium makes cork. What cork is densely packed dead cells. Cork plus the cork cambium itself is called periderm. Keep in mind the cork cambium is way, way external. It's external to the phloem. Okay, so remember we have xylem on the inside, vascular cambium, secondary phloem, primary phloem, and then past that you have the cork cambium. and the cork cambium is producing cork to its outside. Okay, so cork cambium, cork, outside the plant. Okay, so the cork is the outermost layer here. The cork plus the cork cambium, which made it, those two things together is called the periderm. And then if you go even deeper, if you include the phloem in that categorization, the cork cambium, the primary phloem, which we know is next, and then the secondary phloem all the way to the vascular cambium, but not including the vascular cambium, all that is called bark. So stripping the bark from a tree would also be removing the primary phloem and the secondary phloem. So if you girdle a tree, girdling basically just means removing the bark from all around the circumference of a tree. You're removing all of the phloem, in addition to the cork and cork cambium, from that tree. So how does it get sugars from the leaves down into the roots? It can't. So girdling a tree kills it because you're removing the primary and secondary phloem. So only woody plants have a cork cambium, and therefore only woody plants produce cork, and therefore only woody plants have bark. Okay, a tulip or a daffodil or an orchid, they're herbaceous, so they don't have a cork cambium, they don't have cork, they don't have bark, they don't have a periderm. Okay, that's it. I hope that was illuminating. I will see you guys after I get back.